Some stories don't just unfold, they strike like thunder across a quiet sky, pulling you into a world where trust is shattered and power is redefined. This is not simply a tale of business, it is a story of betrayal deep enough to break anyone else, and of a woman who refused to be broken. Promises are made, victories are stolen, and the weight of prejudice lingers like a shadow, yet from that darkness emerges a twist so dramatic it forces even the coldest boardroom to fall silent. What begins as a struggle for recognition transforms into a revelation that no one could have predicted, and the ending delivers a message that lingers long after the last word. Stay with this story, subscribe for more, hit the like button, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what part of the journey you think will shake you most. Juliet Stewart, a talented black woman in her mid-30s, had risen from humble beginnings to the polished glass towers of corporate America. Her presence was striking not only because she carried herself with elegance and command, but also because in those boardrooms, her skin color and gender still made her an exception rather than the norm. On the day she was appointed president of a struggling national restaurant chain, the board members framed their decision with a clear promise. If she could turn the company around, if she could restore profits and rebuild customer trust, then she would be named the next chief executive officer. The promise was spoken in a room filled with tension and expectation, sunlight glinting off polished mahogany, pens scratching against notepads, and subtle nods exchanged between men in suits who seemed both relieved and wary. Juliet listened intently, her heart racing not out of fear but from the recognition of what this moment represented. It was more than a promotion. It was the culmination of decades of work, of nights when she studied by a single lamp while her mother, a housekeeper, came home exhausted but proud, urging her daughter to go further than she ever could. Juliet thought about the little girl she once was, the girl who had to stand in school hallways while teachers assumed she was in the wrong class because they could not imagine a black child excelling. That little girl had dreamed of this very moment, of sitting at the table where decisions were made, and now she was there. The promise of the CEO role was not just a title, it was validation, it was justice for every slight she had endured. She accepted the challenge with steady determination, telling the board she was ready to lead, ready to fight for the company's survival and her rightful place. Yet beneath the polite applause and the formal congratulations, Juliet felt the undercurrent of doubt that swirled like an invisible fog in the room. The sitting CEO, a man with decades in the industry and the kind of entitled ease that came from knowing he was never questioned, leaned back in his chair and studied her with a smirk that never reached his eyes. He congratulated her, yes, but in the way a man might pat a child on the head after allowing them to hold a heavy tool. His gaze seemed to say, "Try if you want, but you'll never truly belong here." Juliet recognized that look instantly. She had seen it her entire life in different forms, in professors who doubted her, in colleagues who dismissed her, in executives who called her articulate as if it were a surprise. This man embodied all those voices rolled into one. But instead of shrinking, Juliet felt her resolve harden. She reminded herself that she had fought for scholarships when money was scarce, fought for internships when doors were slammed in her face, fought for promotions when others were fast-tracked because of their connections or their comfort in the old boys club. She had never been handed anything, and that was her greatest strength. If the board believed she could save the company, then she would save it so thoroughly that even her enemies would choke on their disbelief. She walked out of that room that day with her head high, her mind already turning with ideas, strategies, and the endless to-do list that had become her second nature. At her desk later that evening, she opened a fresh notebook, wrote in bold letters, "Turnaround Plan," and began sketching the future she would build. She knew the numbers, knew the weaknesses in operations, and knew that customer loyalty could be won back if the company dared to embrace change. She also knew that change would not come without resistance. The CEO made his skepticism even clearer when he cornered her in the hallway that week. With a voice as smooth as glass but laced with condescension, he said, "Juliet, remember, if you stumble, the whole company stumbles. Don't let ambition blind you to who really runs this ship." His hand pressed lightly on her shoulder, a gesture meant to assert dominance, but Juliet met his eyes with calm fire. She thanked him politely and walked away, though every step was powered by the determination that she would prove him wrong. Nights turned into weeks of relentless work. Juliet arrived at the office before dawn and left long after sunset, pouring herself into numbers, restructuring teams, and reaching out to managers across the country. Many resisted, seeing her as an outsider who would not last, but she won over those willing to listen by showing results in real time. Sales ticked upward in pilot markets where she had tested new ideas. Younger employees gravitated toward her leadership, inspired by her insistence on fairness and her refusal to tolerate the dismissive attitudes that had plagued the culture for too long. Yet whispers still circulated. Some said she was moving too fast, that she did not understand the way things are done. As a Black woman in a position of authority, Juliet knew she would be tested harder than anyone else, and the beginning of her journey proved that suspicion correct. Every morning she arrived earlier than anyone, reviewing reports and writing notes in the margins, preparing herself for meetings where she would face skepticism. When she walked into the boardroom to present a plan for revamping the menu and modernizing store design, she could feel the eyes of older executives cutting into her, silently dismissing her ideas before she even finished speaking. They interrupted her, questioned data they would have accepted from anyone else, and sometimes laughed softly as though humoring her ambition. Juliet kept her composure, responding with facts and a steady tone, never showing the sting of their contempt. Still, behind closed doors, she learned of their resistance. Regional managers ignored directives, suppliers dragged their feet, and even marketing teams altered her campaigns without approval, testing how far they could push back. It was sabotage disguised as incompetence, a quiet rebellion against her leadership. Yet, in the midst of this hostility, Juliet found unexpected allies. A group of younger employees, many of them women and minorities who had long felt invisible within the company, saw in Juliet a leader who reflected their own struggles. They admired her persistence, her refusal to bend under pressure, and they began to rally around her. They worked late with her, volunteered for difficult assignments, and treated her vision not as a burden, but as a shared mission. For the first time in years, Juliet felt the spark of true loyalty within the company. She knew she could not win over everyone, but she did not need everyone, she needed the right ones. With their help, she began to restructure operations, cutting waste, redesigning kitchens, and reimagining training programs to emphasize efficiency and accountability. It was grueling work, and progress was slow. Juliet drove to underperforming restaurants in small towns and cities, meeting managers face-to-face, inspecting kitchens, talking to staff on the floor. She listened to their frustrations and offered solutions, showing them she was not a distant executive hiding in a tower, but a leader willing to get her hands dirty. Some responded with renewed energy, surprised to find someone in her position who cared enough to visit. Others remained stubborn, dismissing her presence as a publicity stunt. Juliet absorbed both reactions, drawing strength from the former and fire from the latter. The resistance wore on her, though. At night in her apartment, she often collapsed into bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if the obstacles were too great. Her phone buzzed constantly with emails from executives disputing her changes, from board members requesting justifications, from staff needing approvals for even the smallest moves. There were moments when her reflection in the mirror looked foreign, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, her skin drawn tight with fatigue. But every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself of the promise she had made, not just to the board, not just to herself, but to the countless voices she represented. The promise of the CEO seat was still distant, but the promise of proving her worth was in every decision she made. Then came the first glimmer of hope. In one region where she had replaced a resistant district manager with a younger, hungrier leader, sales began to rise. Customer reviews improved, and word spread that changes were working. It was a small victory, but it was enough to silence some of the loudest critics, at least temporarily. Juliet seized on that momentum, pointing to the data in meetings, insisting that the strategy would work if given time. Yet just as quickly, backlash followed. Senior executives accused her of risking too much, of endangering the company by moving too quickly. They whispered that her success in one region was a fluke, not a model. Some even hinted to board members that she was reckless. Juliet fought back with patience and proof, but she could not ignore the undercurrent of disdain in their voices, the way they emphasized her identity whenever she faltered. She doesn't understand this industry. She's not like us. She's trying to change too much. They never said the words directly, but she could hear the unspoken truth. She's a black woman, and she does not belong here. In her quiet moments, she allowed herself to feel the sting, but in public, she refused to bend. She wore her confidence like armor, delivering speeches to employees with passion, reminding them that change was survival, that complacency was death. Juliet kept reshaping the company with a firm hand, removing or reassigning managers who resisted change and filling their places with people who believed in her vision and respected her authority without bias. Gradually, her work began to show measurable results. Customer satisfaction climbed, employees spoke with pride about their jobs, and profits inched upward with each quarter. The progress wasn't a sudden miracle, but its steady pace meant survival and growth. After 3 years, the transformation was undeniable. Profits had doubled, stock values reached heights unseen in years, and analysts who once dismissed the chain now called its recovery remarkable. Investors praised the turnaround as the product of bold leadership and innovative strategy, though few credited Juliet herself. She, however, knew exactly how much she had endured. The long nights, the constant travel, the boardroom battles where her ideas were ignored until undeniable results silenced the skeptics. Even her harshest critics were forced to admit that under her stewardship, the company had not only survived but flourished. A mix of pride and exhaustion filled her. She had delivered what was asked of her and more, and by every measure the time had come for the board to honor its promise and name her CEO. The thought both excited and unsettled her because she remembered the smirk of the current CEO and his cutting reminder that he was still in control. Yet she believed facts carried weight and facts were on her side. Preparing for the meeting, she studied the data again and again, crafting the case she would present: a turnaround achieved, loyalty rebuilt, a business realigned for the future. She planned not to beg, but to demand the respect she had earned, carrying herself with dignity. Then, before she even entered the boardroom, a colleague she trusted pulled her aside, their voice hushed with worry. They warned her that rumors were spreading rumors that the board had never truly intended to keep its word. She sat across from the man who had dismissed her before, the CEO with silver hair and smug certainty, and she asked the question that had haunted her nights. Was it time for her to step into the role she had earned? She did not plead or stammer. She stated her case with clarity, reminding him of the promise, reminding him of the results, reminding him that the company had not just survived, but thrived under her leadership. For a brief moment, silence filled the room, and Juliet allowed herself to hope that perhaps the rumors were wrong, perhaps fairness would prevail. But then his lips curled into that same smirk she had seen years earlier, and his voice came cold and sharp. No, not ever. The words fell like stones in her chest, heavier with every syllable, final in their cruelty. She blinked, stunned, then steadied herself enough to ask why, her voice low but controlled, because even in betrayal she refused to lose her dignity. He leaned back, folded his arms, and delivered a reply that stripped away every pretense. I don't have to give you a reason. It was not about performance, not about results, not about merit. It was about the quiet prejudice that had always hung in the air, now spoken through arrogance. Juliet sat there with her spine straight, refusing to show how deeply the rejection burned, but inside her veins boiled with anger and hurt. She thought of every late night, every moment she had sacrificed her health and her peace, every insult she had swallowed, every fight she had endured, all of it leading to this moment, and yet the door was slammed in her face with a smile. She realized then that the promise had never been real, that the board had dangled it before her as bait, using her to fix the company only to deny her the power she had earned. The betrayal was not just professional, it was personal, an assault on her identity, a reminder that no matter how much she achieved, there were those who would never see her as worthy because of her skin and her gender. She clenched her hands under the table to keep them from trembling, staring at the man who believed he had just broken her. But instead of crumbling, something within her hardened. She understood in that moment that this company, for all the blood and sweat she had poured into it, did not deserve her loyalty any longer. The fire that had driven her to succeed now shifted, becoming a resolve not to beg for what was hers, but to build something greater elsewhere. She left that meeting with her head high, though her chest ached with betrayal, though her mind replayed his words again and again like a wound that refused to close. She walked past colleagues who smiled at her politely, unaware of the battle she had just lost, and she told herself silently that she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her defeated. That evening, in the quiet of her apartment, she let the weight fall, tears finally slipping as she sat with the knowledge that everything she had worked for had been stolen. The betrayal was brutal because it confirmed what she had always feared, that the playing field was never level, that promises made to people like her were often meant to be broken. Yet even as she wept, even as she felt the sting of humiliation, another voice rose inside her, a voice that had carried her through every hardship of her life. That voice reminded her that she had not been made by this company and she would not be destroyed by it. She had turned failure into triumph before, and she could do it again. The betrayal would not define her, her response would. When she returned to work the next day, she carried herself with quiet grace, concealing the storm within. The CEO walked past her with smug indifference, believing the matter settled, believing she would remain in her position, grateful just to have a seat at the table. But Juliet knew differently. She knew that her time here was over, that her talents, her vision, her strength were wasted on those who would never value them. She began to plan her exit, reaching out to contacts discreetly, testing the waters of opportunity beyond the walls that had caged her potential. That knowledge did not destroy her, it freed her, because now she no longer wasted energy hoping for fairness in a place that thrived on broken promises. She decided to leave with her dignity intact, refusing to allow them the satisfaction of seeing her reduced to bitterness. She drafted her resignation letter late at night, each sentence written with calm finality, neither pleading nor angry, simply stating that her work had been completed, her role fulfilled, and her future lay elsewhere. When she handed it in, the CEO raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised, clearly unsettled by the quiet certainty in her eyes. He expected her to cling to the position like a lifeline, to accept his dismissal as permanent subordination, but instead she had chosen to walk away on her own terms, and that unnerved him more than if she had shouted or begged. Juliet left the building that day with her head high, her stride steady, the city lights reflecting in her eyes as though marking the beginning of a new journey. The question that followed her was what next? Because walking away was only the first step, and the world outside was unforgiving. Yet within days, opportunity found her. Harbor Grill, a smaller chain on the verge of bankruptcy, reached out and offered her the role of chief executive officer. It was a struggling brand with failing stores, shrinking revenues, and a reputation for mediocrity, a place most executives avoided because it seemed destined for collapse. To many, the offer looked like a poisoned chalice, a surefire way to bury a career. Critics scoffed, saying Juliet had traded a thriving company for a sinking ship, muttering that she had thrown away her one chance at relevance. But Juliet saw something different when she studied the numbers, visited the stores, and spoke to the employees. Beneath the layers of neglect and poor management, she saw potential. She saw hardworking people who had been ignored, loyal customers who wanted to believe in the brand again, and an opportunity to prove that her talent was not tied to one company but was her own. She accepted the offer without hesitation, telling the board of Harbor Grill that she would not only save their business, but make it thrive in ways they had never imagined. Some of them looked doubtful, but she had grown accustomed to doubt. It only fueled her. Taking over Harbor Grill was a different kind of challenge. There were no glossy towers, no national headlines, no safety net of billions in revenue. There were only failing stores with peeling paint, demoralized staff, and balance sheets drenched in red. Juliet threw herself into the work with the same intensity she had at her former company, but this time she carried something new inside her, a fire forged in betrayal, a determination to prove that her worth could not be decided by those who had dismissed her. She visited store after store, meeting managers, shaking hands with cooks, listening to cashiers tell stories of long shifts and broken equipment. She took notes, asked questions, and made changes that others had been too complacent to attempt. She pored over financial reports at night, restructured operations, cut waste, and introduced fresh marketing campaigns that spoke directly to the customers Harbor Grill had lost. Her presence energized the company, Because for the first time in years, employees saw a leader who did not look down on them but believed in them, and that belief sparked loyalty. Still, the work was exhausting. Juliet often found herself back in the same cycle of long nights and endless flights, her body aching from travel, her mind racing with plans. The critics continued to circle, journalists writing columns declaring that her move was a step backward, that she had squandered her shot at greatness. She read those words with steady calm, knowing they could not see what she saw. They could not understand that greatness was not about titles handed out by men who broke promises, but about the impact one created through perseverance. Harbor Grill became her new battlefield, and she was ready for war. Her former colleagues watching from afar sneered at her decision, whispering that she had destroyed her career. But Juliet had learned not to measure herself by the opinions of those who never believed in her to begin with. She measured herself by progress, by resilience, by the ability to keep moving forward when others wanted her to stop. Walking away from the betrayal had been painful, but it had also given her the chance to choose herself, to bet on her own vision rather than on the approval of those blinded by prejudice. As months passed, the first signs of change began to appear at Harbor Grill. Stores that had been bleeding losses began to stabilize, customers trickled back, and employees showed a new spark of pride. The numbers were not yet dramatic, but the momentum was shifting, and Juliet knew momentum was the beginning of transformation. In her first year as CEO, she attacked the problems head-on, cutting waste where money bled away, closing underperforming stores that could not be saved, and reinvesting in the ones that still had a chance. She negotiated fiercely with suppliers, demanded accountability from managers, and showed up unannounced in restaurants to see firsthand what customers experienced. Employees who had once felt abandoned by distant leadership were startled to see her walking through kitchens, rolling up her sleeves, asking pointed questions, and listening without condescension. Slowly, morale began to shift. Staff, who had resigned themselves to failure now, whispered about the new energy at the top, and word of mouth spread that Juliet was not like the leaders who had come before her. She cared, she pushed, and she expected results not just from others, but from herself. The financial picture was still grim, but small improvements appeared, and those improvements grew month by month until Harbor Grill began to show faint but undeniable signs of life. The real miracle, however, was not just in numbers but in culture. Juliet had always believed that a company could only thrive if its people believed in its mission, so she made fairness and opportunity the pillars of her leadership. She created pathways for women and minorities to rise through management, insisting that talent should never be wasted because of prejudice. She promoted voices that had been silenced and rewarded loyalty with advancement. Employees who once felt invisible now saw themselves reflected in leadership, and their commitment deepened because they felt valued. Customers noticed the difference too, not only in fresher menus and better service, but in the energy that radiated from staff who finally took pride in their work. Juliet's vision was becoming reality, one decision at a time, one store at a time, and though the climb was steep, she never wavered. She remembered the betrayal she had suffered, the words, "No, not ever," and she turned that memory into fuel. Every victory at Harbor Grill was proof that her worth had never depended on those who denied her. The second year brought even greater change. Revenues stabilized and then began to rise, slowly at first, then with momentum that could not be ignored. Analysts who had once predicted Harbor Grill's demise now wrote cautious notes of surprise, suggesting that the chain might survive after all. Juliet smiled when she read those reports because she knew survival was only the beginning. She did not want Harbor Grill to limp along as an underdog. She wanted it to thrive as a leader. She expanded menus with healthier options, launched modern marketing campaigns that connected with younger customers, and rebranded stores with fresh designs that invited people back inside. The results were undeniable. By the end of the third year, Harbor Grill's growth outpaced competitors, and the brand that had once been a joke was now a contender. Investors who had scoffed were suddenly eager to meet with her, and employees spoke of her with respect that bordered on reverence. But Juliet never let success make her complacent. She knew from painful experience how quickly trust could be broken, and she kept pushing, demanding excellence from herself and her team. Late nights still found her bent over reports, her pen scratching notes in the margins, her eyes heavy with fatigue but her spirit unbroken. She told herself that every sacrifice was worth it because she was building something larger than herself. She was building a company where no one would be told they were not enough, a company that would stand as proof that leadership could look different and still succeed. Her persistence became legendary inside Harbor Grill. Stories spread of how she visited 3 states in a single day to check on struggling stores, of how she personally called employees to thank them for extraordinary service, of how she turned angry customers into loyal ones by listening with sincerity. Her presence was felt everywhere, and that presence inspired loyalty. By the 5th year of her leadership, Harbor Grill was no longer a sinking ship, but a strong vessel sailing into open waters, its sails full of wind, its crew united. The turnaround was called miraculous by industry experts, though Juliet knew it was not a miracle at all. It was the product of persistence, of refusing to break when breaking would have been easier, of believing in possibility when others only saw failure. The press eventually took notice of her directly, running stories about the Black woman who had saved a dying brand and turned it into a success story. Interviews painted her as a visionary, though she always redirected credit to her team, reminding the world that no leader succeeds alone. Still, she understood the symbolism of her story, understood that she had become a beacon for those who rarely saw themselves reflected in power. She received letters from young women, from Black professionals, from people who told her that her journey gave them hope. She read those letters late at night and felt tears in her eyes, because they reminded her that her struggle had meaning beyond the balance sheet. Yet even in triumph, Juliet never forgot the betrayal that had pushed her onto this path. She never forgot the boardroom where she had been denied, the smirk of the CEO who dismissed her, the words that had sought to define her as lesser. She carried those memories not as wounds, but as weapons, reminders of what she had overcome and fuel for what she still planned to achieve. Because even as Harbor Grill rose, she began to look outward, to imagine new horizons, to consider what might come next. For she knew that success was not the end of her story. It was only the foundation for something greater. Those words still echoed in her mind, not as a wound anymore, but as a challenge. And she found herself wondering if the story of her redemption was meant to end with Harbor Grill or if destiny was preparing her for something larger. The more she thought, the clearer her vision became. If she truly wanted to close the circle, if she wanted to prove that her power could not be contained, then she would not simply compete with the company that had once cast her aside, she would buy it. The idea came to her late one night as she reviewed quarterly numbers, the spreadsheets glowing on her laptop in the quiet of her office, and at first it seemed too audacious, almost reckless. But the more she considered the possibility, the more it made sense. Harbor Grill was strong now, with rising revenues and investor confidence returning, and her former company, though stable on the surface, had begun to stagnate without her leadership. The cracks were there, same, store sales were slowing, customer loyalty was waning, and innovation had stalled. She saw opportunity in those weaknesses, the chance not only to expand Harbor Grill, but to exact poetic justice on the very people who had underestimated her. When Juliet first mentioned the idea to her board, the room erupted in disbelief. Some laughed outright, others shifted nervously in their seats, and a few stared at her as though she had lost her mind. "It's too big," one director said, shaking his head. "We're strong, yes, but not that strong. Taking on a company of that size could destroy us." Another chimed in, "We just came back from the edge, Juliet. Why risk it all now?" She listened patiently, letting them finish, her hands folded calmly on the table, and then she spoke with the conviction of someone who had already walked through fire. "I know what risk looks like," she said. "I know what it costs. But I also know what it means to let fear dictate your future. If we stop here, if we play safe, we will plateau and eventually decline just like they have. But if we move forward, if we take this bold step, we will not only grow, we will make history. Harbor Grill will not just be a survivor, it will be a conqueror." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment the room was silent. She could see the conflict in their eyes, the tug-of-war between fear and possibility, and she knew she had to push harder. She presented the numbers, the projections, the strategy she had spent weeks refining in secret. She showed them how the acquisition could be financed, how the combined operations would create efficiencies, how the strengths of both companies could merge into an unstoppable force. She spoke not only as a CEO, but as a visionary, painting a picture of the future so vivid that even the most cautious board members could not ignore it. Still, resistance lingered. What if it fails? One asked bluntly. Juliet did not flinch. Then it fails because we dared. But I would rather fail reaching for greatness than succeed by clinging to mediocrity. The turning point came when investors began to whisper about their own interests. Rumors spread in financial circles that Juliet was considering something bold, and instead of recoiling, some investors leaned in with curiosity. They had seen her perform the impossible once, and they wondered if she could do it again. With that interest came leverage, and Juliet used it carefully, courting allies, building momentum, and gradually turning skeptics into cautious supporters. The plan took months to solidify, and each step demanded courage. There were nights when Juliet sat alone in her office staring at the risk calculations, her pen tapping nervously against the desk, wondering if she was leading her company into ruin. But then she remembered the boardroom where she had been betrayed, the words that had dismissed her, and she told herself that some risks were worth everything. If she could pull this off, it would not only change Harbor Grill forever, it would rewrite the narrative of her own life. When the time came to present the plan formally, Juliet stood before her board not as the woman who had been denied years ago, but as a leader who had built credibility through results. She laid out the acquisition strategy piece by piece, answering every question, addressing every fear, and countering every doubt with clarity. Her confidence was unshakable, and by the time she finished, even those who had resisted the most found themselves leaning forward, captivated by the scale of her vision. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. Harbor Grill would pursue the acquisition. News of the plan leaked quickly, hitting the media like a thunderclap. Headlines screamed of audacity, underdog, chain-eyes industry giant, Juliet Steward's boldest gamble, yet can Harbor Grill swallow its former rival? Analysts argued heatedly, some calling it genius, others calling it folly, but no one could ignore it. Juliet's name was everywhere now, her face on magazine covers, her story retold as though it were legend. She handled the attention with poise, granting interviews where she spoke of vision and growth, never of vengeance, though in the quiet of her thoughts she acknowledged the personal fire that drove her. For her, this was not just business, it was justice, a chance to stand where she had once been denied and prove that no amount of prejudice could stop her destiny. As negotiations began, Juliet proved herself once again a master of persistence. She studied every detail of her former company structure, every weakness in its armor, every gap in its defenses. She built a team of advisors who trusted her implicitly, and together they crafted terms that would make the deal possible without destroying Harbor Grill's balance sheet. It was grueling work, filled with long nights, tense phone calls, and constant pressure, but Juliet thrived under pressure. Each obstacle reminded her of the smirks and whispers that had once tried to break her, and each time she pushed harder, determined to turn memory into motivation. By the time the plan was close to fruition, even her fiercest critics began to quiet. They could see that she was not bluffing, that this was no reckless fantasy but a calculated strategy. Investors who had hesitated began to call her directly, offering support. Employees at Harbor Grill, once anxious about the scale of the gamble, now spoke of it with pride, their faith in Juliet unshaken because she had never led them astray before. She had taken them from the brink of ruin to prosperity, and they trusted she could lead them into this bold new chapter as well. For Juliet, the bold plan was more than an acquisition. It was a statement to the world and to herself. It was proof that betrayal could not define her, that rejection could not limit her, that the barriers placed in her path could be shattered by vision and will. She stood on the edge of history, ready to make the leap, knowing that the road ahead would be dangerous, but also knowing that the greatest victories were never won without risk. She spent countless hours with lawyers and bankers, scrutinizing contracts line by line, asking questions others might have missed, refusing to let any oversight slip past her. She studied her former company's operations with the precision of a surgeon, noting every inefficiency, every outdated system, every vulnerability she had once warned about when she was president and which they had ignored after dismissing her. Now those weaknesses gave her leverage because Harbor Grill under her leadership was leaner, smarter, and more agile, and she used that strength to negotiate terms that tilted in her favor. Investors who had once scoffed were suddenly enthusiastic, recognizing that if anyone could pull off a deal of this size, it was Juliet, the woman who had turned a failing chain into a rising star. The media followed every step of the process, turning her into a household name, praising her audacity and debating whether this would be her greatest victory or her biggest mistake. But Juliet ignored the noise and focused on the mission. She told her team again and again, "We are not here just to buy a company. We are here to buy back the story that was taken from us." As months passed, the deal crept closer to reality, and tension filled the halls of her former company as whispers of a takeover spread. Employees who had once seen Juliet dismissed now spoke in hushed tones about her return, some with admiration, some with fear, some with shame. The CEO who had betrayed her scoffed publicly, telling journalists the plan would never succeed, but in private he grew restless, realizing that his grip on power was slipping. Juliet watched from a distance, not gloating, not rushing, but waiting for the right moment to strike. Finally, after endless negotiations, the day arrived when the acquisition agreement was signed. Harbor Grill, under Juliet's leadership, had purchased her former company for billions of dollars, a sum that stunned the industry and sent shockwaves through the market. Headlines screamed across newspapers and screens. Harbor Grill buys former giant, Juliet Stewart's ultimate victory, from betrayal to boardroom power. The deal was hailed as historic, not only for its size, but for its symbolism, because the woman once denied with the words, "No, not ever," now owned the company outright. Juliet stood at the press conference with steady poise, cameras flashing, reporters shouting questions, and she delivered her message calmly. This is not about revenge. This is about growth, about opportunity, about building a future where fairness guides leadership. We did not come this far to settle scores. We came this far to write a new chapter. But behind closed doors, she knew one more step remained, the most personal of all. After the deal was finalized, she requested a private meeting with the CEO who had dismissed her years ago. When he entered the room, he looked older, wearier, his arrogance thinned by the shock of losing control. He tried to mask it with bluster, but Juliet saw the fear in his eyes. She greeted him politely, offered him a seat, and then spoke with calm authority. "We don't need two CEOs, she said, her voice firm, but not unkind. "I'm going to have to let you go." The words, so simple yet so devastating, reversed the balance of power that had once crushed her, and though part of her wanted to savor the moment, she chose restraint. She did not humiliate him, did not raise her voice, did not descend to the level of cruelty he had shown her. Instead, she ended the meeting with dignity, shaking his hand as if to say that even in triumph, she would not let bitterness define her. He left without words, his silence a testament to the realization that the woman he had underestimated had not only surpassed him, but replaced him entirely. Juliet walked out of that meeting with a sense of closure that went beyond business. The acquisition was more than a corporate deal. It was the reclamation of her worth, the rewriting of a story that others had tried to end. Her employees at Harbor Grill cheered, her investors applauded, and the press celebrated her as a pioneer. But Juliet thought of something deeper. She thought of her mother, who had scrubbed floors and whispered to her daughter that she could be anything, and she thought of the young women watching her now, seeing themselves reflected in a position once denied to them. She knew that this moment would be remembered not only as a financial triumph, but as a turning point, a declaration that betrayal could be transformed into victory when met with persistence and courage. The historic acquisition had changed everything. Juliet now stood as the leader of a combined empire, the woman who had saved one company and then used it to buy another, proving that vision could overcome prejudice and that promises broken by others could be rebuilt on her own terms. The world now looked at her not as an outsider, but as a symbol, a living reminder that no barrier was permanent when determination burned brighter than doubt. She felt the weight of the journey, the years of struggle, the nights of exhaustion, the sting of betrayal, and the triumph of persistence, and in that weight, she found strength. She had turned the pain of rejection into the power of ownership, and in doing so, she had made history. Juliet Stewart had accomplished the unthinkable. She had turned Harbor Grill into a rising power. She had negotiated and executed the historic acquisition of her former company, and she had formally removed the man who once told her she would never be CEO. Yet even as she stood at the height of triumph, she understood that how she carried herself in this next moment mattered just as much as the victory itself. The media was eager for a story of revenge, eager to paint her as the woman who had taken down her enemy, but Juliet knew that if she reduced her journey to vengeance, then she would diminish the very principle that had carried her through betrayal and persistence. Her story was not about destroying someone else. It was about proving that dignity and persistence could outlast prejudice, and so when she faced the past, she chose grace. The morning after the acquisition was finalized, Juliet walked into the executive offices of the company she once served, not as the betrayed president, but as the owner and CEO. The halls were familiar, the polished wood, the framed photographs of past leaders, the hushed voices of employees who once dismissed her and now whispered her name with awe. She felt a pang of memory, remembering the weight of humiliation, the sting of hearing, "No, not ever," and the night she cried alone, questioning whether she would ever be enough. But that pain no longer weakened her, it steadied her, and as she entered the corner office, she carried herself with quiet authority. The former CEO had already been informed of his removal, yet he waited for her in silence, his once confident expression dulled by defeat. She sat across from him, her posture upright, her voice calm, and she told him, "I don't intend to gloat. I don't intend to humiliate you. What I will say is thank you. Because when you said no, when you closed the door, you forced me to build another one, and in building it, I found a strength I didn't know I had." He stared at her, his lips tightening, searching for words, but none came. He had no defense, no justification, no smug retort, only silence. And in that silence, Juliet saw the finality of his defeat. She could have reminded him of every slight, every insult, every moment of doubt, but instead, she offered him a hand, a gesture of closure, and after a long hesitation he took it, his grip weak, his eyes lowered. The moment was not about forgiveness, but about grace, about showing that true power was not in crushing an opponent, but in rising above the need to. When word of the meeting spread, many expected her to have unleashed fury, to have savored revenge, but the truth inspired far more admiration. Employees whispered that she had faced him with dignity. Investors remarked that she had shown statesmanship, and even critics admitted that she had handled the moment with rare poise. The narrative began to shift. Juliet was not just a bold strategist. She was a moral leader, someone who could navigate the complexities of business without losing her humanity. This perception only strengthened her standing, solidifying trust in her leadership across the combined empire. Yet for Juliet, the true reward was internal. She had faced a man who once reduced her to nothing and left the room taller, not because she destroyed him, but because she refused to let his cruelty define her. The grace she showed was not weakness. It was strength forged in the knowledge that she no longer needed his validation, his approval, or even his downfall to feel whole. She had built something far greater than revenge. Still, facing the past was not limited to one man. Juliet knew she had to address the broader company, thousands of employees who had once been part of the culture that dismissed her. She scheduled a town hall, standing on a stage before a sea of faces, some familiar, some new, all waiting to hear what the new era would mean. She began by acknowledging the history. "Some of you know me, some of you remember me. Years ago, I stood here as your president, and I promised to fight for this company. I gave everything I had, but when the time came, I was told no. Many of you saw it. Many of you felt the shift, and many of you may have wondered if that was the end of my story. It wasn't." Her voice was steady, her words deliberate, and the room hung on every syllable. She continued, "I did not come back here to punish. I did not come back here to settle scores. I came back here because I believe in what this company can be. I came back here because leadership should be about vision, not prejudice, about opportunity, not exclusion. And I came back here to show you that when you refuse to give up, when you keep building, when you persist in the face of rejection, you can turn even betrayal into triumph." The applause that followed was thunderous, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect. For the first time, many employees saw her not as an outsider, not as a token, but as their leader, one who had suffered as they suffered, who had fought as they fought, and who now stood as living proof of resilience. In the weeks that followed, Juliet received countless letters and emails, not only from her employees, but from strangers across the country. Young women of color wrote that they saw themselves in her story, that her journey gave them the courage to pursue dreams that once felt impossible. Parents told her they used her example to teach their children about perseverance. Even rivals in the industry sent notes acknowledging the depth of her achievement. Each message reminded her that the grace she chose had multiplied her impact beyond balance sheets and market share. It had touched hearts and inspired hope. Juliette Stewart had reclaimed her story with grace. She had confronted the man who once denied her, and she had addressed the company with honesty and vision. And as the days passed into months, she realized that her victory was larger than any acquisition or boardroom triumph. She had become not only the CEO of a global empire, but a living symbol of what persistence, dignity, and courage could accomplish in the face of betrayal. The integration of Harbor Grill and her former company was a complex challenge that consumed her days with endless meetings, restructuring, and strategy sessions, but Juliette approached the work with the same persistence that had carried her through every storm. She built leadership teams that reflected the diversity she had always championed, promoted people who had been overlooked, and fostered a culture where fairness was no longer a slogan but a standard. Employees who had once doubted her now spoke of her with admiration, and customers responded with renewed loyalty, sensing the authenticity that flowed from the top down. The empire she led was not only profitable but principled, and that balance became her true legacy. Yet Juliette knew her mission extended beyond the walls of her company. She remembered the countless letters she had received after the acquisition. Letters from young women, from Black professionals, from people who told her that her journey had given them courage, and she realized she had a responsibility to carry that inspiration further. She announced the creation of the Stewart Scholarship Fund, a program dedicated to supporting young women of color who dreamed of careers in business but lacked the resources to pursue them. She pledged millions from her own wealth to seed the fund, ensuring that opportunities would exist for those who might otherwise be shut out. At the launch ceremony, she stood before an audience of students, parents, and community leaders, her voice steady as she said, "I was told no. I was told never. But I stand here today because I refuse to believe that rejection was the final word. I want each of you to know that if a door closes in your face, you don't have to stop knocking. You can build a new house, one that belongs to you and those who will come after you." The crowd erupted in applause, and Juliette felt a swell of emotion because this was the fulfillment of the promise she had carried all her life. The promise that her struggles would not be in vain, but would light the path for others. The years that followed were marked by continued success, but Juliette measured her achievements not only in profits, but in lives touched. She traveled to universities to speak with students, sat on panels about diversity and leadership, and met privately with young entrepreneurs who sought her guidance. She spoke candidly about her journey, never hiding the pain of betrayal, but always emphasizing the strength it had given her. "Your worth," she told them, "is never determined by those who fail to see it. Your worth is defined by your persistence, your vision, and your refusal to give up on yourself." These words resonated, becoming a mantra repeated in classrooms and boardrooms alike, and Juliette found herself humbled by the impact her story carried. She no longer needed to prove herself to the men who once doubted her, for she had proven herself to the world, and more importantly, to the generations that would follow. One evening, years into her tenure as CEO, Juliette returned to her old neighborhood, walking the streets where she had grown up, where her mother had once worked long hours to keep food on the table. The houses were weathered, the sidewalks cracked, but memories flooded her with warmth. She stopped in front of the small house where she had spent her childhood, remembering the night she studied under a flickering lamp while her mother whispered encouragement, and she felt tears well in her eyes. She thought of her mother's voice saying, "You can be more, Juliette. You can be anything." And she realized that everything she had accomplished was built on that foundation of love and sacrifice. She whispered softly to the empty street, "We made it, Mama." And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to weep freely, not from pain, but from gratitude. Back in the corporate world, Juliette continued to lead with distinction, but she always reminded her team that the true measure of leadership was not in titles or wealth, but in impact. She created programs within the company to mentor employees from disadvantaged backgrounds, ensuring that no one would ever be told they did not belong. She insisted that every decision, from hiring to product development, reflect the values of fairness and integrity. The empire thrived financially, but it also thrived morally, and that balance became a case study for business schools across the nation. As she neared her 70th birthday, Juliet began to step back from day-to-day operations, focusing more on mentorship and philanthropy. She still attended major meetings, still offered guidance, but she allowed the next generation of leaders to take the reins. Watching them, she felt pride, not only because they were competent, but because they carried forward the values she had fought to instill. They were diverse, compassionate, ambitious, and unafraid, and she saw in them the proof that her journey had not been for nothing. On the day she officially announced her retirement, the auditorium was filled with employees, investors, and community members. She took the stage to thunderous applause, her hair now silver, her posture still proud, her voice still commanding. She recounted her journey briefly, from betrayal to triumph, from rejection to redemption, and then she left them with a final message. I was told once that I could never lead, that I would never be enough. But I learned that no one else has the power to define you unless you give it to them. I want you all to remember this. When the world tells you no, when doors close, when voices rise against you, do not stop. Do not surrender. Build your own house, write your own story, and know that dignity will always outlast prejudice. That is the legacy we must leave, and that is the future we must build together. The room rose to its feet, applause echoing like thunder, and Juliet felt a profound peace settle over her. She had ended her journey not in bitterness, but in meaning, not in vengeance, but in inspiration. The end. If you've stayed with this story until the very end, I hope Juliet Stewart's journey has left you with something powerful to reflect on. A woman told she would never be enough turned rejection into redemption, not by revenge, but by persistence, fairness, and dignity. If her fight for respect and her ultimate triumph inspired you, then make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss more stories like this. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part of Juliet's journey struck you the most? And how do you feel about the way she chose grace over revenge? Share your thoughts in the comments, and also tell me where in the world you're watching from, because it's always incredible to see how far these stories reach. Your voice matters here, just as Juliet's voice mattered in her fight. So let's keep this conversation alive.